Hi, and welcome to Gender Nebulous, Series 2, Episode 4. And we have a very special guest today, Mr. Peter Tatchell, human rights activist for the past 50 years and more, no doubt. Welcome, Peter. And we also have my co-host, Miss Frida Wallace, and I'm Victoria Hodges. So welcome, Peter.
It's great to join you.
Thanks for, taking the time out to do this. I know you're a busy man. I'd just like to start with, we met down at Chippenham Pride recently. There was an amazing event going on, the speaker stage organised by Trans Inner City and Bobby Pickard's organisation. And some of the, on the speaker stage, the lineup of guests was quite amazing. I thought there was Lisa Power and Michael Cashman, Lord Michael Cashman, H from Steps, Ian Watkins, Peter Tatchell, whoever that might be, and Linda Riley, the publisher of Diva. So, it was those like the main guests. Your speech was amazing. I thought it was kind of really, it really spoke to me because it was, you have this kind of very powerful voice, and you were kind of speaking directly to us. It was really good. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Let's start with you just arrived in London, age 19, fresh from Australia, and you were probably on your own trying to find some kind of organizations to work with to feel like you're at home. And I think it was around 1970 that the Gay Liberation Front was started. Is that the same time that you'd arrived? Is that the same year?
I arrived the following year, 1971, so about 9 months after the Gay Liberation Front had been established. And when I came to London, it was on the second day in the city that I saw a lamppost sticker advertising the meetings of the Gay Liberation Front. And I thought to myself, wow, I want to be part of that. I had been campaigning as a lone person back in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia, but there were no LGBT plus organizations there at all.
And am I right in thinking at the time, like going back to the 60s when homosexuality was decriminalized, there wasn't like a public kind of appetite for that. The actual law was changed almost against public support, because people often think now like everything is a referendum, things are voted for and things have to be brought to Parliament. But back then, I think that law was changed because it was just seen to be the right thing to do. And that might have caused more backlash in the press, and it might have made people's lives a little bit more difficult. Even though the law had changed, that didn't necessarily mean that life was easier. And would you say that's a fair assessment of the situation at the time?
I don't think there was a public backlash. I have never heard that from people around at the time. But certainly there was a big increase in police harassment of the LGBT plus community. So in the few years after the 1967 Act, the number of gay and bisexual men arrested and convicted or cautioned for same-sex consenting behavior rose by 400%.
Right.
So it got much worse in terms of policing.
So Gay Liberation Front, I think in 1970, it was Britain's first LGBT protest against police harassment. And the first gay pride was in 1972. So were you involved in those?
Yeah, I was involved in the Gay Liberation Front campaign against police harassment.
Yeah.
We, among other things, did a survey of LGBT plus people about their experiences with the police. And we were able to document instances and examples of extremely excessive police behavior. You know, arresting people for giving each other a goodnight kiss at a bus stop, private parties being raided, same-sex couples being arrested for dancing together.
Yeah.
There was a whole litany of horror stories, but it was really useful that we were able to get this ammunition, this evidence to prove what we were saying. The other thing, of course, is that we did, challenge the police. You know, we did protest against the police about their way they were treating us, and that was, well, it was unheard of before the Gay Liberation Front, and it began to put the police on the back foot because they'd never previously been challenged.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was looking at when I was kind of researching this interview was that London Gay Pride 1973, there was a homosexuals are revolting poster. I think it was something that you have been involved in putting together. And then at the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Gay Liberation Front in 2020, was it Martin Farrell who had updated your poster to say homosexuals are still revolting? Because that image, for me, it's really kind of interesting how, 50 years later, it's been updated like that.
Yeah, I mean, I made that poster in my
Was that for a protest you were going on at the time?
No, that was for the 1973 Gay Pride March.
Okay.
So that photo of the post, that's me with my friends Noel Glynn and Ted Brown.
Okay. Right.
And the photo was actually taken in Hyde Park after the march was over. We had a gay day picnic in the park after the Pride March. But going back to your previous question, yes, I was involved with about 30 other people in organising and promoting the first ever UK Pride Parade, which took place in London on the 1st of July, 1972. There were only about 700 of us, because back then, most LGBT plus people were in the closet. They didn't dare show their faces because they feared arrest, being beaten up, being sacked from their jobs, being evicted by their landlords, being ostracized by their friends. So, to get 700 people in 1972 was we thought quite an achievement. Nothing by comparison to now, but back then that was a success in our eyes, and it emboldened us to do further protests, further Pride marches in the years that followed.
So when you were doing those kind of protests in the 70s, in that era, were you constantly being abused by police and getting arrested and all those kind of things, or were they, would they kind of leave you to it? I mean, what was the atmosphere at the time?
I'll give you one typical example. In late 1971, the Gay Liberation Front had been alerted to pubs and bars that refused to serve, quote, queers and puffs and lesies. So we took a policy of going to those pubs and bars and demanding to be served. One of them was the Chepstow in West London in Notting Hill Gate, Bayswater area. And about 30 or 40 of us went there one night and demanded to be served. The landlord refused to serve us, so we refused to leave. We sat down in the pub. The landlord called the police. I think about 3 or 4 vanfuls of police arrived and proceeded to drag us out of the pub. I was one of about half a dozen people who were singled out to be lined up in the alleyway at the side of the pub. And it was a freezing cold October night, but the police made us strip down to our underpants. And then a big burly sergeant came along the line, put his hand in our underpants and squeezed our testicles until we screamed.
Unbelievable.
That's the kind of thing the police did back then. And there was nothing you could do about it because the police were a law unto themselves. There was no police complaints procedure, no police ombudsman. They could get away with it.
So this sounds to me like it's not just the story of gay liberation. It's a story about police brutality, because you obviously a target for the police. So Did you have sort of affinity with black communities at that time? Because obviously they would suffer the same kind of prejudices. So the kind of clubs or the kind of places where gay men would find safety may have come across with the same places where black and ethnic minority people were meeting. So was there sort of cross-pollination there between those communities?
Well, you're right. I mean, the Gay Liberation Front had a generalized view to oppose all oppression. So we stood in solidarity with the Black and Asian communities, with the women's liberation movement, with working class and trade union struggles. We believed that we were part of a broad spectrum of human rights and social justice campaigners, and that we should work together and support each other. Now, it was not always reciprocated. The Gay Liberation Front, I think, was the only non-Black organization to stand in solidarity outside the court during the trial of the Mangrove Nine.
Right.
9 Black activists who were framed by the police, but we were there to show our solidarity. I've got to say that they were not overly welcoming of us being in attendance. So some of them were, but there were also some raised eyebrows and visible hostility from some of the Black activists there, who didn't acknowledge that LGBT plus liberation was a legitimate liberation. Likewise, when the Conservative government passed the notorious, or sought to pass the notorious Industrial Relations Act in 1971 against the trade union movement, the Gay Liberation Front was there marching in solidarity, but it was attacked by some sections of the crowd. You know, the banner poles were hurled at us, coins, was abuse. So again, you know, we showed them solidarity, but they didn't always show us solidarity.
Was that did that not deter you? You always stood in solidarity. And did you? I was going to say, like, because you mentioned the Conservative Party. At what point did real political politicians from elected parties start to notice or perhaps support you in a parliamentary way? Was that later, or was that about this time?
Well, the first part of your question, definitely we took the view that no matter what others did or said about us as LGBTs, we were going to stand for what is right.
Right.
We would stand and support them, even if they didn't support us. And I think over time, that did result in respect. That people who perhaps were hostile or unsympathetic began to come around because they saw the fact that regardless of how we were treated, we always treated them right and stood in solidarity with their struggle. The second part of your question, it was not until the 1980s, really, that significant numbers of politicians began to support LGBT plus rights. And they were almost entirely Labour MPs. And I would say there wasn't a huge number of them, maybe 20 or 30 at the most. You know, people like Tony Benn, Audrey Wise, Dawn Primarolo, Jeremy Corbyn. You know, these are the stalwarts who stood with us in very difficult times, and they were often pretty much lone voices.
Do you think that might have been because they were trying to protect their own closeted world, because they might have been because obviously homosexual acts were going on in Parliament, and it's probably well known that politicians were engaging in homosexuality, lesbianism, whatever, but they wanted to keep control of the narrative. So rather than obviously you as protesters could potentially out people, if they got on the wrong side. So I think there's like a protectionism rather than them wanting to, help anybody. They would see it as putting something in the way because they know that they could be exposed.
No, I don't agree with that.
No.
These Labour MPs were stalwarts who supported us out of genuine conviction that LGBT plus rights were human rights. There was no self-interested motive. In fact, they got a lot of flack criticism,
Mm.
and probably some of them lost votes.
Oh yeah, I
So
think
there's
I think I might have misspoke that, because I was trying to say the people again, like in the Conservative Party, more likely, who obviously would have been a culture there where they would have been doing things behind their wives' backs, so they would create that narrative, and that, so obviously they don't want to talk about homosexuality because it means they're talking about themselves in a lot of cases,
So,
and they
so
could
Peter,
be exposed by the press.
yeah. So just going back to the GLF. I mean, it kind of did it finish in '73? Because I think it was only around for about 3 or 4 years.
Well, 74, I think. It devolved into groups. Instead of one central meeting, there were several. Like there was South London, West London, East London, North London.
So was that the kind of the seed organization which later on became OutRage? Is that kind of where it started from?
No, no.
No. Okay. So let's okay. So I know that's like a decade later. So, or maybe 2 decades later. So we were just talking about the '80s there, and politicians. Now you stood for the Bermondsey by-election, didn't you? And this election was, I think it's renowned as the most homophobic in modern British history. You were assaulted in the street, had your flat attacked, death threats, bullet through your front door. Could you just tell us a bit about what was going on in that campaign that you were part of?
Well, I was a left-wing Labour candidate. I was arguing for sensible left-wing policies like a national minimum wage to combat low pay. And I was denounced by the press and by politicians. They said that was an extremist policy. I argued for a negotiated political settlement to the war in the north of Ireland. And I was denounced as a supporter of the IRA. I wasn't. But, what I proposed eventually became Good Friday Agreement in 1998. I argued in favor of a comprehensive law to protect everyone against discrimination. That was also denounced as extremist, even by some in the Labour Party. So I was way ahead of my time.
Yeah.
But you are right. Most commentators say it was the dirtiest and most violent election in Britain probably since 1945, or maybe even beyond that. And it was certainly the most homophobic in British history. There's never been such a homophobic campaign before or since.
And you didn't win that by-election, but who was it that you were up against at the time?
I had at the time a record 14 rival candidates.
Wow.
There'd never been so many candidates in a single by-election before, including 4 neo-Nazi and fascist candidates.
Gosh.
The Liberals, the Conservatives, a real Labour candidate who was standing against me because of my left-wing and pro-LGBT plus policies.
Yeah.
And a few others like the Lord Sutch of the Monster Party.
Yeah. So, I mean, what did you do in the kind of the years after that, before OutRage began? What things were you doing there? Because I think that was, that was '83. I don't think OutRage started until 1990. So what kind of exciting things were you up to during that period?
Well, the intense homophobia I experienced in the Bermondsey by-election brought home to me the scale of prejudice and discrimination we still faced. So I began to put a lot more energy, not just in general human rights issues, but also particularly into LGBT plus issues. So I was for several years operating as a freelance campaigner. I got together ad hoc coalitions of people to challenge the homophobia of the church, to challenge homophobia in the media, to challenge the police over the way they were oppressing our community, to challenge the government and Parliament as a whole for its failure to legislate LGBT plus equality. But these were all ad hoc coalitions each time. It wasn't a specific organization. You're right, it wasn't until 1990 that OutRage was formed. And I was there at the founding meeting with about 30 or 35 others. So we collectively founded it in that year and began a series of very high-profile direct action protests, non-violent, peaceful, but direct
Was
action
this
protests.
the kissing in public protests and that kind of thing?
Yeah, we had a mass kissing in Piccadilly Circus, a queer wedding in Trafalgar Square, a mass turn-in at Bow Street Police Station where Oscar Wilde had been detained after his arrest in 1895. Lots of things like that. And the effect of those protests was to get masses of media coverage, which was our aim. But that wasn't an end in itself. The purpose was, through media coverage, to raise public awareness about the scale of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And through that, change hearts and minds, to build public support, to change public opinion, so that then politicians would feel confident that they could change the law.
So there were some really kind of well-known kind of actions that you did during this time. I mean, as we just spoke about, September 1990, there was a group organized, the kissing at Piccadilly Gardens. There was also Piccadilly Circus. There was also outing by FROCS, and later, admitting the plan had been a ruse and the goal of getting newspapers, which had outed themselves. Can you just talk about that a little bit? I know that also kind of plays into the story that you told at Chippenham Pride about the Easter sermon by George Carey. There was this kind of outing thing that you were talking about. Can you just tell us about
that? FROCS was a subgroup of OutRage. It wasn't an official OutRage group. And FROCS stands for Faggots Rooting Out Closeted Sexuality.
Right.
It was basically three people within OutRage, and this was their own thing. They announced that they were going to out 200 leading public figures and accuse them of homophobia and hypocrisy. The charge was going to be that they preached against homosexuality, but were LGBT in private. So it was all about exposing hypocrisy and double standards. It created a huge furore. But as you say, the whole thing was a ruse. They never intended to out anybody, but they used it as a way of exposing the hypocrisy of the mass media. Because the mass media went berserk, saying this is outrageous, this is disgusting, and all the mass media who were doing this had been outing people left, right, and centre for decades,
without a lot of hypocrisy,
without any moral purpose, just because they thought the gay people were despicable and didn't deserve respect and dignity.
Well, historically, the British press have always been, pretty vicious. And when they find a target, they want to, and it's so politically motivated. Like, they have the ones they like, they have the ones they don't like. Just speaking about you personally, Peter, did you become singled out as somebody that because obviously your name is in the ascendant, people start to know your name, they know who you are. So when, say, if they do want to talk about gay rights, you start to come up as the go-to kind of spokesperson. Has that been a problem for you sometimes? Because when you are a lone voice, sometimes when you are a voice out there in the ether and people know who you are, does that put a lot of pressure on you then to always say the right thing, to always be representational of perhaps every issue? And is that been a pressure for you, do you think?
Well, of course, I became a household name during the by-election in Bermondsey in 1983, and indeed in the run-up to it, because, of course, for 15 months I was banned as a Labour candidate,
right,
because I advocated non-violent protests against the Tory government, and they said this was anti-parliamentary. So there was a huge furore, and there was an attempt to block me from ever standing, but eventually the Labour Party relented. So after the Bermondsey by-election, I could have gone away and gone back to my working career in journalism and housing rights, but I thought I would use my public profile to champion LGBT plus rights and other human rights issues. So I never set myself up to be a spokesperson for the community. It's not possible for any one person to do that. I was essentially speaking for myself and the coalition that I organized for each of these particular campaigns. So I think it was in 1987, the Church of England had its General Synod, and we organised protests outside because the Archbishop of Canterbury was saying that gay people are sinners and must repent. So we did a protest to challenge him, and the Church of England's Parliament. But we were never claiming to speak for everyone in our community. And the same with OutRage. OutRage spoke for itself and its supporters. We didn't speak for the entire community. And likewise today, I do not claim to speak for every LGBT plus person. On most issues, I do probably reflect the consensus that, conversion therapy should be banned, that trans people should be able to change their legal documents by self-ID through a statutory declaration. Those are the general consensus.
Yeah.
But there are some issues where people won't agree with me, and that's fine, But it is always a pressure and a burden in a sense that, I'm very conscious that I'm very lucky and privileged to have a media platform, which many don't. So often I will try and get others to be given the platform. So recently I got invited to do a couple of interviews, and I specifically said, well, I actually think this person would be better. They are Black, they know the issue better. Yes. They are trans, they know trans issues from their own experience. So I try to use my position to give a platform to others. And also, of course, wherever possible, when I do speak, to mention other relevant organizations, like Trans in the City or UK Black Pride.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, because I've been, in my small way, been involved in some TV debates. I've been on Talk TV, because they tend to be the people that agitate these kind of polemics. And when I'm asked to go on something like that, I'm very much aware, am I representing myself or the trans community? So that's why I wanted to ask you that, because obviously when you go on something like Talk TV or GB News, you are very much aware that they're not batting for us. You're there to disrupt the conversation. And that's why I think I wanted to ask that, because I've sometimes felt like, am I being used, or am I adding anything to the conversation? Because I get a lot of backlash from other trans people, maybe, so I don't know why you do that. It's just a setup. And I don't think, do you feel sometimes like that, like I did, that perhaps it's negative? When you speak to Piers Morgan, for example, he's not going to give you an easy ride, but he also misses the point you're trying to make as well. So do you think that's...
Well, you are absolutely right to go on GB News and Talk TV. That's exactly where your voice and the voice of trans people needs to be heard. It's easy to talk to The Guardian or the BBC. You want to reach the audience who are watching or listening to Talk TV and GB News. You want to get over to them an alternative point of view. Because if you don't do it, all the audience will hear will be an anti-trans argument. Yeah. So this is why I get very frustrated. I try not to do too many, interviews where trans is a factor, but sometimes they say, look, we've tried. They often reel off a list of 5 or 6 people they've tried who've refused to do the interview. So I think to myself, well, better that I do it than nobody does it, and these bigots are allowed to spout what they want.
I think a lot of the reasons why people may refuse to do those interviews is because of the hate that they will get on platforms like Twitter, after doing it. Because Frida's been on several times these kind of shows, and the pile-ons afterwards on Twitter are absolutely disgusting. Wow. It's horrendous.
Well, I've had people try and get me sacked from my day job. I've had people try and dox me. I'm not even that. Well, to imagine what it must be like. In a way, I suppose you've gone through this for so long that perhaps you build up a kind of way of dealing with it. But it was quite a shock to me, actually, when I first realised that there are lobbyists like Sex Matters. I'm sure you've heard of the LGBT Alliance. They are very pernicious in trying to attack us. So when somebody like me does put my head a little bit above the parapet, they want to cut it down straight away. But I obviously I'm not a shrinking violet, and I have tried to encourage other trans women, trans people, non-binary people, but we are quite shy, really, and we just want to get on with our lives. And I think that, do you think that, because the conversation has shifted, just to go off on a little bit of a tangent now, but the conversation has shifted to trans a lot more, I've noticed. And do you think that takes something away from what you're trying to do, or are you able to add to that conversation? I suppose what I'm asking is, do you think the trans issue has become far too much the media are talking about?
Well, trans rights are human rights. They have to be defended. So if trans people are under attack, we have to all collectively defend the trans community. And if that means going on programs to face horrible bigots, so be it. I'm never expecting to change their hearts and minds, but I'm aiming to change the hearts and minds of some of the viewers. And only just 2 days ago, someone came up to me in the street and said, "Oh, well done on GB News. You know, I watched it a lot.
Yeah.
I never understood the trans issue, but you explained it so well. I'm now totally on side." So that's just one example of how you can change people's understanding and promote acceptance. So I know it's tough. I mean, I would advise that if you're, anxious about it, just don't look at Twitter for a few days. I mean, sometimes I don't look at my Twitter feed sometimes for days on end because it's so toxic.
It is. Yeah.
I think some of the things that people worry about when they do that is they'll come after you and try and get you fired at your job.
Yeah.
So there is a risk associated with putting yourself so far above the parapet. I mean, how do you deal with that, Peter?
Well, fortunately, my Peter Tatchell Foundation will not be swayed at all by.
No, they're not going to fire you on.
Umpteen attempts to fire me and so on. No. But of course, in the past, I was doing freelance journalism and research, and people would try and get me fired. They never succeeded, but they did try. And yes, it was quite nerve-wracking. But fortunately, I was working for organizations that were not swayed by what was obvious prejudice and, false and malicious allegations. So I think everybody must weigh up what they feel able to do, what they feel safe and secure in doing, and then take it from there.
Well, it's been like a steep learning curve for me because, I mean, obviously sometimes in those interview situations, you can sometimes feel very defensive because you've obviously got a dog in the fight, but you've got to think, who am I speaking to right now? And I always think of my mum because my mum doesn't understand the issue. So if I can speak as if I'm talking to somebody at home who isn't necessarily trans or isn't necessarily reading Twitter all day, that might come across a little bit better. Because in the first few things I did, I was very angry, and I think I didn't want to be the angry trans person on the telly, but that's what it kind of came across. But I mean, I think I was justifiably defending what was basically a made-up story in the paper, because they made up some stories about children identifying as cats, and the whole thing seems like obviously that was a story about school bullying that became that because it benefited the narrative, and it's a dehumanization tactic. And I think that was the subject that you were invited to go on to Piers Morgan to talk about. And what I noticed was Piers Morgan totally did deflect and start asking you about Philip Schofield. And I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. But I think you handled that pretty well. So I don't know what I'd have done in that situation, but
you're right. The tactic you've used is very good. Just imagine you're speaking to your mum or to a friend, or if you think about it in that way, it makes it much easier to, first of all, to stay calm, be rational, and just come across as a reasonable person. Sometimes there are outrageous things said, and my heart sort of jumps that I want to scream it back. So I just stay calm. The important thing is to come across as being polite and courteous and reasonable. And that's how you win people over.
That's very hard.
I've noticed when you do interviews, Peter, you with somebody like Piers Morgan, he might be attacking you and saying all kinds of things, but you always stay on point. You repeat what you say several times, and you always kind of keep it very calm and bring it back to that point. And it's a really powerful way to kind of get your message across. You just kind of stick to your points, keep making them as the conversation continues.
Yeah, there was something else I picked up on the Piers Morgan thing. I think is it Douglas Murray? And Douglas Murray seems to represent what has become this gay, not queer kind of culture, where we accept that we're gay now. All the work is done. There's nothing to worry about being gay. We've got all our rights. It's like this arrogance because he is from he's obviously from a privileged background. And it's like they reject queerness. They reject the expression of queerness because do you think that has always existed in gay lib? There's always been like the drag queens, the kind of outsiders, the people on the street. And then there's like been sort of a strata of gay oppression. So people who are more conservative will say, "Oh yeah, well I'm gay, but I'm not. I've got nothing to do with those people." So it can seem like there's a, within the gay community now, there seems to be this schism, and I don't know if that's historic or if it's a recent thing. Is that would you?
Well, going back to the days of the Gay Liberation Front, I remember we were very scathing of what we called the Chelsea Queens. These were middle-class, well-off white gay men,
Right.
who were just, their whole life revolved around parties, socializing, things like that. They weren't engaged in any campaigning. They looked down on us. They saw us as troublemakers and extremists. There's always been a strata within our community who have reaped the benefits.
Yes.
The campaigns of people like myself and many others, but never contributed anything, and then have often turned around and rubbished what we've done, or battered for our critics and opponents.
I was going to say, I sometimes get what you call tone policed a lot, because I came out of a very queer kind of punk movement. I like Derek Jarman, and I was interested in, I met the artist Dougie Fields. I'm not sure if you're aware of Dougie, and those kind of people. And they were kind of very visual, and the way they spoke, because a lot of my friends were drag queens. So when I started to talk on trans rights, I had to sort of change the way I spoke a little bit, because a lot of trans women, they weren't from that queer culture. They transitioned perhaps later in life, and I sometimes thought, oh gosh, I'm being told off for being, so there was also that. So I think what I'm saying is, within a minority, there are always going to be other little minorities that agitate for each other. And like someone like you, Peter, who I think, does speak very well, runs into trouble a little bit, and you do get people saying, oh, you said this wrong, you did that wrong. Does that get tiresome sometimes?
Well, of course, I'm sufficiently able to acknowledge that I don't always get it right. And in fact, after nearly every interview I do, or every public talk, I always think, oh, I could have done better. I should have said that, So I'm very harsh and self-critical. And, it used to beat me up a lot. I used to have, I've been musing over it for hours and hours afterwards, and, getting a headache, and my stomach would be churning over. I think to myself, I've had this very lucky, privileged opportunity to speak, and I didn't do it right. So I'd be really angry with myself. But nowadays, I'm a bit more cool and relaxed. I recognize that no one can get it right all the time. And the important thing is to judge a person on the totality of their contribution. And we are all allowed to make mistakes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, you've had all these kind of, years and years of doing these protests and things. And let's talk about the Netflix film, the documentary that came out recently, Hating Peter Tatchell. I mean, that film kind of summarizes all these major events that you've been involved with over the years. I mean, I know that film wasn't produced by yourself, but how did you get involved in that project? Because it was an amazing film. It left me thinking, wow, look at the stuff that Peter's been through, especially the story around Mugabe and how you were beaten and left unconscious on the road. I mean, it was horrendous, some of the stuff you've been through.
Yeah. Looking at that film, it brings back a lot of mixed memories.
Yeah, I bet.
Some pretty painful episodes of beatings that I've experienced. But the film began back in 2015, when the filmmaker Christopher Amos approached me and said that he was very surprised there'd never been a documentary made about my life and campaigning, and that he would like to do it. So it was his film. He had total editorial independence and control. I just assisted him by putting him in contact with people he wanted to speak to, giving him copies of old VHS tapes of programs I'd been on, so he could get the originals. And then, of course, he accompanied me to Moscow in 2018 when I staged a protest on the opening day of the World Cup in Moscow.
Yeah.
But I collaborated with him very simply because I wanted to show that social change is possible, and through my own campaigning, give people tips and ideas on how to achieve it. So I hope that having watched the film, it will inspire more people to become
Well, I've watched it.
change makers.
I've
Change
watched it twice. I intend to watch it again because I found it really inspiring. It kind of, you watch that film and you think, right, what am I going to do? How am I going to go and do things like
it
this?
did make me think about that, because
it's really inspiring. It truly.
I mean, it made me realize that it could be just that one moment that changes history or changes people's minds, because we can campaign forever and write to politicians, which is all not disregarding that. It's brilliant if you want to do that. But it can be just that one action where the cameras are there just at the right moment. And that, I think, is what comes across. It's like, and obviously that's a very risky strategy, but I think it's paid off. And obviously with the Moscow, the World Cup. Yeah, and recently you were in, where was it? I know the recent World Cup.
Qatar,
that was it.
Yeah, you were the lone voice there, really. So I was thinking that, there's Peter on his own in a country that if I went to, I'd be terrified. And there you are.
I was terrified.
Yeah.
But it's so disappointing, because the footballers did want to wear, you remember the One Love armband?
Yeah.
And they went back on that. And I was like, gosh, are you there for us or are you not? And obviously that's to do with FIFA's political wranglings, but less said about that, the better.
So that Qatar incident, were you arrested and then released?
I was detained on the pavement for nearly 1 hour, interrogated extensively about who I was, where I was from, how I got into Qatar, who I knew in Qatar, what my plans were, etc. In the end, I actually told the police and the security agents, I said, look, this is looking very, very bad. This protest has been filmed. It's already been sent to news agencies all around the world. It's going to be a PR disaster. You better sort it out. And then unfortunately, my foundation officers in London contacted the Foreign Office here in London, and they contacted the British Embassy in Qatar, and they got on the phone to the Qatar authorities. So it was a combination of all those things that ended up releasing me without charge, but telling me I should go to the airport and get on the next plane.
Yeah, so
which is what I did.
As someone who is quite as
Sorry.
famous as you are in these kind of scenarios, do you feel as though you have some kind of privilege, in the way you're treated? Because I know if I was to do that, I probably wouldn't get the same, respect from the authorities when I called them up and asked them for help. I mean, do you find, as you've done this for so many years, that you've been treated better because of who you are?
Yeah, over time I have been treated better, no doubt about it. And I am lucky, I am privileged. There's no doubt about that either. But I think it is earned.
Absolutely.
Over time.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Lots of people will say, I don't always agree with you, but I admire you for sticking up for your principles, or I know you have a good heart.
Well,
I think Sir Ian McKellen said that in the documentary. Yeah, there was a really nice section in there where the two of you were talking about various things. I think he made that statement, actually.
I was going to say, you certainly put yourself in the line of fire. There's no doubt about that. I was just thinking, there was a recent protest for Trans Pride this Saturday, and you were there. And what took all the media attention, and I wanted to know what you felt about this, was Sarah Jane Baker. And because of some of the words she said, I think she said something, if you see a TERF, you punch them in the face. I think that was the quote that made it to the Daily Mail. And I was thinking, well, actually, what Sarah did there, even though I don't fully agree with that sentiment, she's actually drawn a lot of attention. Now, would you say that was a good move or a bad move? Because I've been humming and ahhing about this, and I'm writing a little piece about it, and I fully support Sarah because of what she's been through as a human being. I think she arrived at that moment through a lot of pain. But would you say that was a good action, or how do you feel about that?
I can understand the rage and anger, given what trans people have suffered over the years and decades. I totally get that. But I think it's very important that we fight high when others fight low.
Yeah.
We shouldn't stoop to their tactics. This is the kind of stuff that trans critics say against trans people and trans allies. We shouldn't reciprocate in kind. We should maintain the moral high ground.
But in reality, Sarah's using words. She's not harming anyone, and I think the rhetoric is strong, but it's free speech at the end of the day. If that's what Sarah feels the need to say, it's performative. I think it's in the tradition of protest. And the people, like Suella Braverman put a tweet out, didn't she, saying we need to get the police to find. I mean, calling the police on Sunday for a speech, that's a very, it's a very grey area. I don't want to go down that road, do we? So
well, incitement to violence is against the law. And I myself, as a trans ally, and all my trans friends, have experienced many, many incitements to violence against us. So I don't think we should respond in the same way.
I think,
let the trans critics play dirty, let us play clean.
I think when we do play dirty like that, I mean, I think we're gifting the other side,
yes, we are,
something against us, which is probably not the wisest things to do.
But I still maintain that moment, that speech, I wouldn't say it was a speech, it was more of an utterance of aggression.
I agree with the sentiment, but I don't agree with the wording.
Yeah, I agree with we needed that kind of powerful, because I don't think that would have been reported at all in the media. I don't think any of those speakers would have had that. I mean, even though the messaging we can disagree with, I think in a longer timeline, when it's like the thing with Ali Rabushkin, in New Zealand, she poured the tomato juice over Kelly J. Keane, and I think that was a necessary action to get the press attention. And I supported Ellie, and we've spoken to Ellie on the podcast, haven't we? And so it's those kind of things. While they might seem violent, might seem extreme, I think sometimes they are necessary. Would you agree with that?
Well, no, not really, because what has happened is, instead of focusing on the just cause of trans rights, focus is now on the violent rhetoric. And I know quite a lot of trans people have told me personally that they think it was a huge mistake, because it made that threat, that incitement, the story, rather than the fact that nearly 30,000 people marched through London. And we had all great speeches from people like Munro Berghoff and many others that didn't get reported. So
I know you were certainly there.
Yeah, I mean, it does deflects the attention, doesn't it?
I think we've got to stick to using the methods that reflect what we aspire to. If you want a kinder, more gentler society, you must use those methods. You can still have direct action. Gandhi and Martin Luther King and many others did amazing, provocative, confrontational things that challenged the establishment, broke the law, and were incredibly powerful. But part of their power was their non-violence. The fact that they did not resort to the violence of the British state in India or the violence of the police in the southern states of America. They maintained the moral high ground, and that won public sympathy and support. Whereas, for example, in Ireland, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, which was non-violent, had huge public support in England, Wales, and Scotland. But when the IRA began their violent terror campaign, that support evaporated. The issue became not the cause of United Ireland, which I support. It became the methods, the violent methods of the IRA. So I think, the means you use have to reflect the goal you aspire to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I couldn't really compare what Ali Rabushkin did and sort of Baker to the IRA necessarily, but I understand what you mean. And I think, that's that when the public do get to witness that as trans rights, or that they probably, that's what they take away. But I think when we don't have the support of the media, when it's really difficult for somebody like me to speak publicly and get the kind of attention that you have to do it in a kind of extreme way. And while we can agree that those actions are probably going in the wrong direction, it just seems to be they've happened because they're not in isolation. They've happened because nobody's listening to us.
I think,
and it's
I think there's a
people
lot
like you,
of
Peter, that do actually
frustration.
speak for us.
Yeah, I think if you want to make an impact, you don't need to do it by inciting violence, which is a gift to the LGBT Alliance and other groups. Go and occupy Suella Braverman's home.
Yeah.
Go and blockade her car in the street.
Well, we have
So
told
that brings us on to this.
Those are dramatic actions that will get you media coverage, but in a non-violent way.
Yeah. So this brings us on to this topic of non-violent direct action, which I know is something that you always talk about, Peter. That's your kind of your thing. So, how do we go about doing that in such a way that, we're not putting ourselves at too much risk? We're doing the protest, we're doing the direct action. It's non-violent. I mean, what would your advice be for someone who's not really done this before and, wants to do something, but is worried about the consequences of, being arrested, losing their job, getting into trouble, where, and then comparing that to, well, if I don't do anything, nothing's ever going to change. I mean, you have to choose. Frida and I talk a lot about the effectiveness of protest. And I think your style is probably one of the most effective because it's non-violent, it's direct action. And you always make sure the cameras are there too, to get the publicity. So could you just talk us through, how do we do this?
Well, I think, the starting point is that trans rights is a just cause, a very powerful just cause. And if we are able to explain to the public why and tell the stories of trans people who have suffered victimization and discrimination and hate crime, then we will begin to change the narrative. See, a lot of people do not understand or realize the scale of hostility and victimization that trans people face. They may have a general idea, but it's only when the personal stories of individuals are told that it really gets to a lot of people. And this is the tactic we used back in the 1980s when we were battling for lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights. We told the stories of individual people who had been victimized. So, for example, the two lesbians who were arrested for giving each other a goodnight kiss at the ticket barriers at Victoria Station. We told their story, and lots of people who were not necessarily pro-LGBT plus saw that that was an absurd, monstrous abuse of the law. So telling stories is one thing. And the other thing is, making the protest, targeting the right people, and doing the protest in a way that's either daring or provocative or confrontational or witty or humorous. Humor or wit is a great way to diffuse hostility. If you can make someone laugh and give them a chuckle, then you've got half the battle won.
So do you go through a bit of a process before you're going to go and do something? You kind of go through a process kind of thinking about these things? Like, we've got that angle covered, we've got that angle covered. Is that how you do it?
Yeah, I sort of plan protest like, a military commander, plans a war. I assess, all the strengths and weaknesses, what resources we have, what could be achieved, what might go wrong. I always have a plan A and a plan B, and sometimes even a plan C.
I think that's really an important point.
I was just going to say, I've got so many plans for things, but like if I come to London, Peter, can I come and meet up with you and we can plan a strategy?
So here's one of Frida's ideas. What she wants to do is she wants to buy a water cannon, fill it with rainbow paint, drive down to Tufton Street and spray it on the walls of Tufton Street. So
you've blown my.
Sorry, I've blown the whole thing now. Yeah, but,
no, I know.
You better edit that out of the final version.
Yeah. Well, we can. One thing I did want to say is because what it is, I sometimes feel like a lone voice, and I have ideas, and I feel like I don't want to be like an organizer. I want people to be on the same page and not have to be the person saying, right, we need to do this, because I find it difficult to be, I mean, I can organize and I can do that, but I don't want to feel like I'm on my own doing that. So if there's not enough network of passion for it, I feel like, well, I could do it on my own, but then I'm risking quite a lot because I work for quite a public facing organization that I'm not allowed to mention. And this is why people have tried to get me fired. So I feel like almost restrained by having to live one life and then wanting to do the other. So once I get that freedom, I think it might be dangerous, Victoria.
I think I should add that Frida's not actually going to do this. It was just an example. So
okay. If I can just add that, you there are things you can do alone by yourself, but it's always better to do it in a group. So I am the public face, but I have my foundation supporting me and backing me, organizing and doing things to make sure it all happens and works well. So it is best to try and get together with other like-minded people and as a group do something.
I think one thing might
safety in numbers.
Yeah, one thing, because I'm up in Manchester and we do things in Manchester, but I think it'd have to be in London, you see. So I'm sort of disjointed. But the great thing is the internet. So we can network and we can
bring the cameras up north,
But the thing is with me, like my protest has been getting myself in the media. Like when I'm on GB News, I feel like I'm in a hostile environment and I'm in the way of a conversation. And that might have more effect than me standing on a street corner with a bullhorn. Do you know what I mean? So that's why I've done that. And obviously, like I said before, through doing that, I've had the pushback of people from the trans community who also say, well, you're feeding, you're working with the enemy. I said, well, no, I'm not. I mean, that's the only way I'm going to get my voice heard. And it's quite easy to get on those kind of shows. That's the irony of it.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to tell them or remind them that those programs have viewers. If you're not there to speak up, the only perspective those viewers will get is of the anti-trans critics. And so it's really important that you or others are there. If we just leave them to get a one-sided anti-trans view, those people's hostility to trans people will be reinforced. Whereas if you're there, you'll help break it down.
So it's really more about disrupting what they're doing.
Yeah.
In a way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
also on trans issues, I don't always succeed, but I do try to challenge what they're saying.
Yeah.
Often by starting out by saying, look, do you realize that every trans person I know and every trans ally I know, including me, whenever we defend the trans community in the most polite and courteous way, we get threats to kill us.
I know, it's horrendous.
Castrate us, burn down our homes. That's what your toxic language is helping to fuel.
Yes.
And they really back off then. I mean, maybe it's just me, but they puts them in a bad place,
Well,
rightly.
So this topic of free speech, I know this is another one of the things that you talk about a lot, Peter, and there's been a couple of things on Twitter recently. I know there was a bit of a spat over Ep-4 status. You'd put something on Twitter about that, and I think you got some backlash. But the way I see it is that what you were saying is that you were saying, this person has a right to free speech, and I think how it sometimes gets interpreted is that you've said something in support of that person, and I think you made it very clear that you're not supporting their view, but you are supporting free speech. Now, the thing that I struggle with is, where does free speech become hate speech, and then it leads into incitement and violence and worse? How do we find the boundary between free speech and where it starts slipping into something worse?
So very quickly, free speech is one of the most precious of all human rights. People went to prison and were even killed to establish that right and freedom. So to restrict it, there has to be very strong, compelling grounds. And there's only basically three. First of all, if someone makes false, damaging allegations against someone, like saying they're a paedophile, a rapist, a wife beater, or a tax fraudster, that is not free speech. That's an abuse of free speech.
Mm-hmm.
Next, if someone engages in harassment, threats, and menaces against a person. And thirdly, if they incite violence. Those are my 3 red lines. Otherwise, the best way to deal with bigoted ideas is by challenging them, exposing them, producing the evidence to show why they're wrong. And that's what we did in the 1980s when we were battling against homophobia, when we were fighting for LGBT rights.
Yeah.
We gave the counter arguments, the evidence to show why that's wrong. And of course, protest against the people. So I didn't support Germaine Greer being banned from speaking at Cambridge University, but I did very strongly say that she should have an alternative speaker up against her, a trans speaker, to give a different point of view. And I supported the protest outside the Cambridge Union.
Yeah. So I think it's the clear definition between, what you're saying is hate speech and free speech, and when it becomes hate speech. I think it's those 3 kind of rules you have there. I think that it kind of explains what it is you're saying, and people do misinterpret that sometimes. I know we have limited time here, so just like to say thanks so much for coming on and doing this, spending time with us. It's really interesting conversation, valuable. And also, Pete, thanks for your unending support for the trans community. I think that's wonderful. It's great to see such a prominent person as yourself doing that. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
There is one more thing we ask of our guests, and we have a little song at the end of the podcast where
you don't have to do it.
You don't have to do it, but it's don't forget to subscribe. It's very simple. That's all. So that's all we do. So before we do that, is there any kind of final word? What would your message be to the trans community?
Well, first let me say, if you want to find out more about my work, please go to my foundation's website, Peter Tatchell Foundation.org.
Mm-hmm.
In the top right-hand corner, there's a button which says Join Us. If you give us your email address, we will send you free of charge a weekly roundup of LGBT plus and other human rights issues. And you can unsubscribe anytime. My final word for tonight is, for trans people and allies, for everyone everywhere, don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen.
Yeah, thank you. So Frida's going to lead us in the little song, and then
this is just a little tradition, a bit of a laugh we do at the end, because we've never been able to do it right. So the song is "Don't forget to subscribe," like that. So I'll count us in after 3. So it's 1, 2, 3. Don't forget to subscribe. Well, that was terrible. It
was terrible, but it's always terrible, and we absolutely love that part.
Your final message was absolutely fantastic for us there, Peter, and I'd like to just say thank you for taking the time to do it. And I think Vicky, have you anything to add?
No, just thank you for coming on, Peter. It's great to see you. Hope to see you in some other place soon, and maybe on a protest.
Great. Thank you both very, very much, and best wishes to all your listeners and viewers. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.